Mike from MotoIQ here. Today I'm going to give you something that probably all of you want to know. 3 ways not to blow up your engine. Now, blowing up the engine is something that a lot of us enthusiasts fear about. And when you modify things and you drive harder, you do track days, you go to the drag strip, you do some drift days, you even start competing, the chances of you blowing something up gets to be more and more. And I'm going to tell you how to avoid those pitfalls. So, reason number 1, don't overheat. Now, this might seem pretty obvious, but like being engine builders, we see a lot of busted engines come through here. And probably the number 1 reason that starts them on the hill of decline is overheating. Now, this could be pretty easy. Like a lot of engines, especially turbocharged cars from the factory, a lot of them tend to overheat when you drive them hard on the track. Like you'll never overheat one probably in anything you could do on the street, but take it to the racetrack, and if it's a place like Southern California, sometimes it gets to 115, 120 degrees out in the nasty desert where a lot of our tracks are at, and sure enough, they overheat. Now, a lot of you want to spend money on fancy go-fast parts, but once it overheats, it's all over. So we did a whole video on how to avoid overheating, but I'll just give you a couple of easy things. One of them is to install a big racing radiator. This is just about mandatory if you start increasing the power. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but with a turbo car, it's easy to almost double the horsepower in most of them with just bolt-ons and the tune. Doubling the horsepower, you're basically doubling the heat, so make sure you can dissipate it. A good racing radiator is good, cheap insurance, a lot cheaper than a blown engine. The other thing is an oil cooler. Most factory oil coolers are totally inadequate for track use. If your car has an oil cooler, it's probably some little dinky thing, but dissipating that heat, the oil is the second thing besides the coolant that draws heat out of your engine. Now, what temperatures do you want to avoid? We found that to keep things happy on most cars, and I'm saying most cars, there's always some exceptions, but just about any car, you'll be safe if you keep the coolant temperature below 230 degrees and the oil temperature below 250 degrees. The reason why we want to keep the coolant temperature below 230 is, in every car it varies a little. A lot of it depends where the sensor is, how it's picking it up, which is another thing. Never believe your stock coolant gauge. You want to actually read the actual temperature your engine's seeing. So a lot of, you can get an OBD scan tool and actually set up a dashboard, maybe on your phone, and have it in the holder up there where you can see it. Or you want to install like real racing gauges so you can monitor the actual temperature. By the time your stock gauge registers that you're overheating, a lot of times your engine's toast. Those things have a lot of delay in them, and they can be 30, 40, 50 degrees off even. Some of the factory gauges only have 2 positions, like overheating and normal, and they kind of interpolate in between the two. So don't trust your factory gauge. Get a real temperature reading on your engine. When your coolant temperature gets too hot, a lot of bad things happen. When it starts getting really hot, your head and your block could start distorting. Like we've seen like as much as maybe 12 thou of distortion in between the bolts on the cylinder head, for instance. This is like warpage caused by overheating. And you're losing 12 thou of clamp force. What does that mean? Your head gasket's probably going to blow. Also, we've measured similar distortion in the deck of the block, like up here. A lot of times this distortion is permanent and can only be cured by taking the engine apart. and resurfacing things. So if you have distortion in your deck up here and here, you can lose like over half the clamp of your head gasket, instant blown gasket. Also, when everything starts to distort, you lose your ring seal. You start getting more blow-by. More blow-by means more of your oil gets puked out the breather. That's never good, which can lead to oil starvation and other things. When you're running really hot, it can also cause a cascade of messing up. So you get hot, you get glowing spots in your cylinder head, in the combustion chamber. That leads to detonation, which is a whole nother thing that we'll talk about real shortly. So basically, don't overheat. That's your number one thing. Check out our video on the subject we did a couple of weeks ago. We get totally in depth of how to prevent overheating. The next thing is a big kind of complicated one. Number two is don't detonate. Now, detonation is uncontrolled combustion in your cylinders that's not controlled by the spark plug and not controlled by your engine's ECU. Now, most people call it detonation, but you can also hear it called knock or pre-ignition or something. The basic causes can be slightly different between all of them, but you know, a lot of people want to argue with me about the semantics, but it's all the same thing. It's uncontrolled combustion going on in your cylinder. What's bad about this is the combustion can start at an odd time, like as the piston's coming up to top dead center, for instance. You get like a explosion, and the piston coming up plus the shock wave of the explosion puts a tremendous amount of force and heat into your cylinder. You know, that's what you hear, that knocking or pinging noise. You know, it could sound like a knock, a ping, sounds like gravel being rattled in the can when it's super bad. But all of this is no good. If you ever hear it when you're driving, like back off, get off the throttle, don't drive hard again until you figure out the cause of the detonation. You know, I'm saying this because detonation could destroy your engine in a matter of seconds. Some turbocharged cars, detonation can knock you out in just a few knocks, especially if you have like a turbo rotary or something. It doesn't take much to mess one up. Same thing with a Subaru with stock pistons. Just a few knocks when you're full sending on boost, and that's it. Time to disassemble the engine. Now you get this, these force shock waves going through your engine, putting a tremendous load on your bearings, your pistons, your rods, even your crankshaft. Puts a lot of stress, like we've seen detonation damage on rod bearings, for instance. In an extreme case, this doesn't happen very much, but we've actually seen the main bearings being showing signs of distress. Like we haven't seen a spun main bearing yet due to detonation, but we've certainly seen overload indications on the mains of an engine that's been detonating bad. Some of the other things is that it can erode your valves and fissure your valves. It'll cut right through it, like the temperature and pressure wave, and you'll lose your valve seal. Most commonly, you see damage on the piston. The piston gets, you know, like, I guess like not too severe detonation is like a sanded texture. So you'll see something that looks like someone sandblasted your piston. It'll usually start on the exhaust side of your piston. If it's really bad, it'll be all over the whole piston, but generally detonation damage starts on the exhaust valve side. So you'll see some sandblasting. You know, that's a sign that your engine's been detonating. You can also see the sandblast damage on the exhaust valve side. It'll be typically, you know, be on the edges of the combustion chamber on the exhaust valve side. On the sharp edges, you'll see this sandblasted texture. That's an engine that's been detonating but hasn't broken anything yet. When it gets really bad, the piston will actually flex. It'll get really hot, flex, bend down, and it'll trap the compression rings, making the rings stick, and you'll lose compression. Really severe cases, you'll actually break the first few ring lands, and that'll render your rings not operational. I've even seen super severe detonation on like perhaps nitrous motors or turbo motors that got a load of bad gas or a failed injector. It actually looks like a cutting torch cut through the edge of the piston and totally wiped everything out. If you ever get detonation that bad, it's rebuild time for sure, and hopefully it hasn't messed up your block and you can still clean up the bore. Other detonation damage, as you can see, sometimes the piston pin is blued, underneath the piston crown is discolored, your bearings are hammered, particularly the top part. The bearings are really prone to damage because they're soft metal, and if you exceed the load bearing capacity of the hydrodynamic film, guess what? Your bearings get chewed up. So detonation is bad juju. You don't want to have any of that going on at all in your engine that's driven, rigorously, like in motorsports or even hooning around somewhere. How do you avoid detonation? Well, detonation is caused by too much cylinder pressure, and that could be caused by a number of things. It's usually too much of things you think are good. So too much boost pressure, too much ignition advance. Those are the main causes of detonation that we've seen. It could also be caused by running too lean. Another common cause is insufficient octane of whatever fuel you're using. All this are some of the common causes of detonation. There's also a lot of user-induced causes of detonation. For instance, the big one is running the wrong heat range spark plugs. Now, your spark plugs all have heat ranges, and your stock plug, since the manufacturer doesn't want the plug to foul out in normal driving, they have a long heat path of the center electrode out through the shell. This is a whole nother subject. I'm just going to go over it real quick. So basically, the nose of the center electrode stays hot, and you don't get any of that carbon fouling on it. The bad thing about it is it's hard to conduct heat out, and the plug can get really hot, start glowing real red hot, and even melt. When it starts glowing red hot, it can act like a glow plug in a diesel and trigger uncontrolled combustion and detonation. So you got to make sure you have a cold enough plug. Now, colder plugs have a shorter heat path out of the center electrode, and they run a lot cooler, so you're less likely for that to happen. The disadvantage is that if you sit around idling your car all the time, they're more likely to foul out. So, like, let's say you have a tuned turbo motor, you should at least do one heat range colder, maybe two heat ranges colder before you go out on the track. If you have a really built NA motor and you've increased the compression ratio, like 1 or 2 points, you should at least have one heat range colder, maybe two. So pay attention to your plug heat range. It's a big thing that a lot of people overlook, and we've seen it blow up more than a few warmed over motors. Now, if your engine's totally stock, you probably don't need to worry about it, but once you start modifying things, particularly on a turbo engine, look out and pay attention to that. Make sure you have enough fuel pressure always. Like intermittently leaning out is another cause of detonation we've seen on track-driven cars. A lot of it is you don't have a good fuel pickup, your car leans out in the corners, or you have enough fuel pump capacity and big enough fuel lines that when you do a dyno pull, like one pull in tuning, you have sufficient fuel pressure. But when you rip through all the gears, your pump can't keep up and you start leaning out. That's another thing. Don't lean out. Also, make sure you have enough injector. this isn't as common, but a lot of times when you put bigger injectors, your pump has a hard time keeping up with the volume that the injectors suck up. So, make sure your fuel system is solid. Having good enough gas. A lot of what happens is a lot of people like to run pump gas, but their tuner's trying to stretch that pump gas or every bit of power it can make. And you can hardly blame the tuner because everybody talks, and if one tuner doesn't make as much power as the other tuner, well, guess what? He's going to lose business. So every tuner tries to get the best results. And pump gas isn't the best thing for running on the track. It tends to detonate, especially states like California that have oxygenated gas. So a lot of these fuels have a lot of what's called light ends, and light ends are simple volatile hydrocarbons that burn real easy, and these things help reduce your HC emissions. So some fuel like California, probably New York, or any of those super liberal places probably have a lot of those things in your fuel. Now, these fuels, the light ends, they ignite easy, but they're also really easy to ignite as pre-ignition and detonation. So it's not too good to push your car to the limit on these. So if you're going to the track, it might be good to get some 100 octane unleaded race gas and maybe mix a few gallons if your car's been tuned on pump gas. That gives you like a little bit of protection. The other thing you might want to consider is setting your car up to run flex fuel and run E85. Now E85 is a tremendous track fuel. Your car will run probably 10 to 15 degrees cooler, and you have a lot more detonation margin. I've been tuning some cars on E85, and we've been able to advance the timing so far that the power falls off with no detonation. So E85 is a good fuel to run for the track. Same thing with E98 or any of the ethanol-based fuels, but E85 is cheap, easy to get in most states, and with flex fuel, you can run E85 on the track and then gas on the street and have the best of both worlds there. The last thing that's the big cause of detonation is your tuner. Now, a lot of you have turbo cars, and probably a lot of you have a tune in there. Now, the tuner is usually a businessman, and all tuners are under pressure to get really good results, and you can hardly blame them. Also, some tuners are a lot better than others. A lot of guys are guys that buy a tuning license from HP Tuners or AcuTech or something, and they go in there and they just crank up the boost and crank up the advance, lean it out, do a hero dyno run, and send you on your way. The best tuners are actually like really smart guys that have a deep intellectual understanding of combustion, fuels, engines, engine theory. I kind of call these guys calibrators. And they really think about your tune and try to make a tune that'll serve you best in the way you're going to use the car. Now, your typical hot dude tuner will just like tune your car to do one hero dyno pull, send you on the way. But, guess what? Like when you're on the track, you're at wide open throttle for, as much as a minute. Like you'll spend a minute easy at wide open throttle on a minute 30-second track. And you're going to be through all the gears at full throttle. A dyno pull is like, maybe 15 seconds through fourth gear or something. So you're going to get a lot more heat in your engine. Your combustion temperatures are going to be higher and they're going to be maintained. You're going to get a lot more heat everywhere. So, a tune that didn't detonate on a dyno pull could be like death on the track. So pick your tuner carefully. Make sure he has experience with tuning track cars, and maybe he has a record of tuning some track cars that have run successfully, and be careful. even if you get a tuner that's like one of these one gear hero dudes and you tune on pump gas, if you slip like maybe 30% race gas in there, you'll probably still be safe. So that's good insurance. So number 2, don't detonate. If you keep your car from detonating, it's going to live a long time on the track, as long as you follow rule number 3. So rule number 3, which is the last of the big 3, is don't run out of oil. Now, you wouldn't believe how many times we've seen a car that's come here and it's total oil starvation. Like, it usually has a rod knock. That's if the guy's lucky. If he's unlucky, there's a rod out the side of the block. All engines burn oil. So even under normal conditions, the piston rings, it's their job to keep the oil in the car's bottom end and not in the combustion chamber. So you have your oil ring and you have your compression rings, and they all work to scrape the oil off the cylinder walls and not let it get in the combustion chamber. But no matter how good your rings are, some of that oil will still get in there and get burned. Like if you're driving on the street, most cars won't even burn a quart of oil in your normal oil change interval. It's to the manufacturer's best interest to be like that, because oil in the combustion chamber is, hydrocarbons out the exhaust and makes it difficult to meet emission standards. But when you're driving on the track at high RPM, those rings have a lot more work. It's one thing to keep your cylinder walls and the combustion chamber free of oil at 3,000 RPM, but if you're at 7,000 or 8,000 RPM all the time, you're really increasing the amount of work that the rings have to do to keep oil out. So burning more oil is very common on the track, and you can expect to burn 2 or 3 times more. Another thing that you have to consider is when you're running on the track at high RPM and full throttle all the time, is you get more blow-by. Now, even if you have really good rings, you get combustion gas past the rings, especially on the turbo engine when you're running boost pressure and everything. These rings are holding back a lot of pressure, and on the street you don't see that much, but when you're on boost, on throttle all the time, you get a lot more blow-by, we call it, and your crankcase pressure goes up. So your crankcase vent system has to deal with a lot more pressure. So your PCV and your crank vents are the blow-bys going out, and when everything's spinning around your engine in high RPM, there's a lot of entrapped oil with all that blow-by gas. We call it windage. So a lot of that oil is also getting blown out of your breathers. That's why we talk about, if you have a turbocharged car, having an air oil separator is pretty good that can return oil back to the pan. Now, a lot of you guys that track turbo cars, you've probably, if you run a catch can, for instance, you probably noticed that your catch can can completely fill up in one track session. So, that's like a pint or a quart of oil getting kicked out, and that's not even including what your PCV might have sucked up. Or, you take off your charge pipes, for instance, and then you'll notice your intercooler's full of oil. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean something's wrong with your engine, but it's kind of like part of the game when you're tracking a turbo car, or, like a hot naturally aspirated car that you're winding up. So it's imperative that after every single session, when you come off the track, you need to check your oil level, and sometimes you might be a quart low or even more. You also probably want to empty all your catch cans and keep track of how much is getting blown out every session. Watch your oil like a hawk. Watch it every single session, and then fill your oil up. You might want to make sure you fill all the way up to the top of your full on your dipstick, but you don't want to go past full. What can happen then is your crank counterweights and stuff will start dipping into your oil because your crankcase is too full, and it'll like whip the oil up into the windage cloud, make more oil flying around. It'll also froth up your oil. Frothy oil doesn't lubricate as good. All that splashing and whipping around increases your oil temp a lot. So don't overfill, but keep it full. Another thing is to have a really high quality synthetic oil. Mobil 1's good, Royal Purple's good, Motil's good, Redline, but you want to make sure it's 100% synthetic and it's the highest grade. Like all that load and temperature breaks down oil fast, and mineral oils break down way quicker than synthetics. Synthetics, like if you have any kind of something sketchy in your oiling system, can sometimes save your ass. If you look at MotoIQ, we have some articles about things like that. But make sure you have a really good oil. Make sure your oil's fresh. Like I say that for a turbocharged car, you probably want to change your oil every event. If you have a naturally aspirated car, I would say you should want to change it every 2 events. So I consider an event like a Saturday and a Sunday, so maybe that's 6 sessions, 6 to 8 sessions. So one event, maybe 6 to 8 sessions. Turbo car, change your oil. Naturally aspirated car, 14, 16 sessions, something like that, change your oil. It might seem like an overkill, but it'll pay off in the long run. Now, you want to keep your oil temperature, we mentioned before, below 250 degrees. So there's some reasons for that. The first reason is most oils typically start to degrade around 250 degrees, especially mineral oils like synthetics. They don't degrade or oxidize till maybe higher, like in the 300s, but why push it? Now at high temperatures, the oil wants to combine with oxygen, and it'll oxidize and it'll form like that gross black sludge that sticks to everything and doesn't lubricate and causes your piston rings to stick and bearings to spin and all that. So you never want to get into that zone. A good oil cooler will keep you out of there. The other reason that people don't talk about too much, but it's probably the most important reason to me, is your engine bearings are made out of soft metals with low melting points. They're usually like leads, aluminums, coppers, alloys of them. Like if you ever messed around and made fishing shot or something, like you can melt lead in your saucepan on the stove even. And the best bearings still have lead in them. Even stuff like aluminum has a fairly low melting point. But what I'm getting at is these metals, even if you're not running them at their melting point, they still lose a lot of their load-bearing capacity. Like aluminum loses more than half its strength at 350 degrees, for instance. So you want to keep that oil below the point where those metals start to, well, it's kind of complicated, but to keep things simple, I'll say before they start getting soft. Most bearings, especially like nowadays, they start to lose their load-bearing capacity at about 250 degrees. Now, there's guys that want to argue with me about that, but I've seen OEM data about it, and I used to be an OEM engineer, so we used to try to design things around that. Nowadays, there's a big push to remove heavy metals from engines, so they remove like a lot of the good alloying elements, and they're removing lead and things like that from the bearings. So the modern greener bearings have even less load-bearing capacity, and they start to soften at lower temperatures. So 250 is a good safe point, maximum point for most engines. You don't want to exceed that, or you can get into the zone of spun bearings. So You want to run a good oil cooler. You also want to have a good way of monitoring your oil temperature. So you want to have a good sender unit like in your pan plus, like a gauge or something, and watch that oil temp. Finally, there's mods to your oiling system. Now, if you're running a close to stock car, you probably don't need to worry about this. So if you're running stock street compound tires of the stock size and you have stock suspension, you're probably safe. But, if you're on our channel, you probably can't resist that urge to modify. So a lot of you have bigger tires, R compound sticky DOT tires. Sure, a lot of you have trick suspension, trick alignment settings. And a lot of you might even have aero and compete, like in Time Attack or Grassroots Motorsports. A lot of you probably drift, and drifting, even though it's at lower G-forces, still generates a lot of back and forth load. Now, what you got to worry about is your oil sloshing around in your pan, exposing your pickup, and your oil pump and everything momentarily sucks air. Now, when this happens, you lose the hydrodynamic film of oil that's protecting your bearings. You do that. These bearings are made out of such soft, low melting point alloys that if you have metal-to-metal contact, even for a second or two, you get micro welding, and bad things happen from there. You'll have total bearing failure after a few times, and you'll spin the bearing. Usually you spin your rod bearing. That's when the bearing seizes to the crank because it's gotten too soft and almost molten, so it'll stick to the crank and it'll spin in the rod. When you spin the bearing, your oiling holes don't line up anymore, and you lose all your oil pressure, and then in seconds, the thing will start glowing red hot, and there goes your crank. And if you keep going, your big end of the rod will start to get super hot and weaken, and then your rod bolts break, and that's the end of your engine. Usually the rod goes out of the side of your block, and you have a pretty expensive bill. So you want to avoid sucking up air at all costs. Now, once you start getting into that point, I guess the first thing to do is to get a really good oil pressure gauge. Like, don't trust your stock one if your car has one. And you want to have some kind of data logging capability. Now there's apps on your phone that can do that. It's going to require a little bit of configuration. AEM makes a little logger, but do something where you can keep track of your oil pressure. And if you see your oil pressure dip even the slightest, it's time to invest in some things to prevent that. One of the things is to get a higher capacity oil pan. Now this is a Greddy one for an SR20. It kind of bolts onto the stock upper pan. It adds about a quart more capacity. I took out some of the baffles, but it has baffles to keep the oil around the oil pickup and to help get the oil from these wings over closer to the pickup. Depending on your engine, like if you have baffles with trap doors that allow the oil to go in but not out around the pump pickup, that's all good. It's really common in maybe LS high performance pans to have that. If they don't make a pan for your engine, it's not super difficult to have a fabricator maybe modify your pan with baffles and more capacity. The other thing you could do is add a windage tray. The windage tray and the crank scraper helps strip that windage cloud away from your spinning around crank, gets that oil and returns it to your sump, so your sump oil level stays more consistent. Also, with a lot less oil flying around, your oil consumption goes down and your oil temperature drops. I mean, I've seen a good windage tray drop the oil temp like 10 to 15 degrees. So those things can really help keep your engine supplied with oil and reduce your chances of bearing failure. If you still see your oil pressure drop, what you could do for a kind of a cheaper solution is get an AcuS Sump. An AcuS Sump is a accumulator that keeps your engine fed with oil in case the pickup sucks some air. So it's basically like a big bottle with a floating piston. You have pressurized air on one side, and your oil pump fills up the bottle with oil. And when your oil pressure drops, that oil gets squished into your engine, and it keeps it from running totally dry. The AcuS Sump doesn't cure everything. Like, it won't prevent your oil pressure from dipping, but like, let's say if your oil pressure was hitting 0, it'll at least keep your oil pressure up to like 15, 20 psi. The other bad thing about the AcuS Sump is that it can only feed your engine for like maybe 3 or 4 seconds. So if you're in a long turn, the AcuS Sump will run dry, and then your oil pressure will be a few psi low while the oil pump works extra hard to fill the AcuS Sump back up. But if you have momentarily low oil pressure, it can save your ass. It doesn't cost that much, and it's not that hard to hook up. I've had a lot of success with these in drift cars, for instance, because they have a lot of momentary spikes where they lose oil pressure due to the violent back and forth things. Now, if you've really modified your car, and like, let's say your car is capable of pulling like 1.2 or 1.5 Gs even, and more than that for several seconds, like in a sustained corner, about the only thing that's going to keep your engine from losing oil pressure is a dry sump. So if you have like a formula car, for instance, or you have like an unlimited class time attack car with slicks and big aero that like maybe Andrew Brilliant or something designed your aero, you're going to need a dry sump. That is, if you want your engine to be happy and live. Now, a dry sump is a external pump that is like a super pump. Like, it sucks everything out of the crankcase. It sucks out the windage cloud, sucks up every bit of oil, so the crankcase is dry, and that's why they call it a dry sump. It gets this oil, puts it to a remote tank. The remote tank has elaborate air oil separators and stuff, so it gets all the air out, and you're putting nice, clean, unaerated oil, like at full pressure, into your engine all the time, no matter how high your revs and no matter how hard your Gs are. Dry sumps are a big secret to long life, and they're expensive, but if every one of our customers had a dry sump, it would probably cut down the failures by like probably 20% or something. So a dry sump is the most expensive, but your last line of defense to have really good oil to your bearings. So, those are the big 3. Take care of those, and you'll have a lot of fun. You'll spend more time driving, less time fixing. I guarantee it. And you might have to invest a little bit of money, but your engine's probably the most expensive part of your car, and anytime you break that less or make it last longer, you're actually saving a lot of money. As a final thing, if you do blow up your engine, what's probably the most important thing is you got to conduct an autopsy of it, figure out why it blew up, and then do the necessary mods so you don't repeat the same thing. We'll probably do a video on how to do an autopsy on your engine at a future time, but make sure you figure out what the root cause of your engine failure was and don't repeat it. So if you like our content, be sure and subscribe. I try to bring you the best tech that I can think of that's the most practical. Go to MotoIQ.com. We have like probably thousands of articles there that you can read, and they're all tech heavy. You can probably read there for years if you're so inclined. Visit our parts store. The link's below. We have competitive prices on most of the parts we talk about. and the proceeds help us produce better content. If you like my sick hoodie and other MotoIQ merch, you could also get our merch at the web store. So I hope this stuff all helps you. If you follow everything I said religiously and avoid failures due to the big three, you'll be thanking me. So until next time, have fun out there.